We've covered psychoanalytic identity theory now, and we're going to be moving forward into social structure theory. So just to back up and review a little bit about psychoanalytical identity theory, it is more of a psychological theory than a sociological theory. So it studies more at the individual level and the workings of the mind and the reasons for behaviors. While this is a sociology course, it's also got some aspect of interdisciplinary studies to it, because there's no way you can really understand the social aspect unless you also understand the individual workings of the mind and the motivations that may be behind it. So we've looked at what is generally considered a more psychological perspective, and now we're going to be moving towards more of a sociological perspective for the next couple of sessions. Social structure theory looks at why society might want you to learn certain kinds of behaviors. So there is an interesting structural functionalist aspect to it, because structural functionalism would go back and look at the institutions and why institutions want to promote certain kinds of behaviors. So that idea of why society wants a certain kind of behavior or needs you to fulfill certain kinds of roles, that fits really well under the social structure theory type of analysis. What we do know is that gender differences, and when we're talking about gender differences, we're talking about how an individual displays the characteristics that are associated with their biology. So gender is much more of a cultural kind of a concept, whereas sex, whether you're male or female, is a biological perspective. So when we're talking about gender differences, we're talking about how we display what it means to be female or what it means to be male. Examples: how we dress, certain kinds of behaviors, the types of roles that people engage in. So gender differences are greatest when women are in subordinate roles in society. The more unequal a society is, the greater those gender differences will be. So in a more egalitarian society, such as Scandinavia, women don't tend to dress as feminine, and men don't tend to exhibit such extreme masculine behaviors. The other interesting aspect that I'd like to talk about a little bit now is the idea of feminine behaviors generally being powerless behaviors. So what's considered feminine is to have a limp wrist, or to be standing in a position where you're off balance. In contrast to that, what is masculine is a powerful behavior, having a stance that is very solid. Feet are positioned in a way that would be very difficult to knock somebody over. Shoulders up and back. That's a masculine behavior. Versus feminine, shoulders shrugged and helpless, or taking up less space. So thinking in terms of how females and males communicate, there is the concept of touching downward. What that refers to is that it's much more acceptable for a dominant member of a class to touch a subordinate member versus the other way, for a subordinate member to touch a dominant member. So an example of that is myself as an instructor. If I saw somebody in class, a student in class that was having a hard day, it would be much more acceptable for me to touch them on the shoulder, touch them on the arm, and say, hey, you look like you're having a bad day. Is everything okay? Whereas it would be much less acceptable for that student to touch me on the arm and say, hey, Professor Hopf, are you having a bad day? So it's this idea that the dominant member exhibits a certain amount of control by touching the subordinate member. It doesn't have to be a controlling or aggressive touch, but just any kind of touch at all suggests that the dominant member has the social status to be able to touch the subordinate member. Another aspect of communication is that the subordinate members tend to be more sensitive to the dominant member's issues. So if the boss comes in and the boss is grumpy, it's much more likely that the subordinate members are going to be aware of the boss's attitude, their supervisor's attitude, versus the supervisor being concerned about one of his subordinates, whether they're having a bad day or not. So the subordinate members of society tend to be on the watch for what the dominant members, what their emotional status is. Just like an example in a pack of wolves, that the subordinate members are going to be watching and staying out of the way of the dominant group members. Socially, we also know that emotional work is generally assumed to be the work of women. And examples of that is who plans the birthday parties, who plans the social events, who takes care of making sure that gifts are bought or cards are sent, Christmas cards, birthday cards. Those types of emotional tasks more generally fall into the area for women. We also know that women in organizations tend to not make it to the top of the organizational structure. So whether it be corporate or politics, more often whoever's in a position of power, whoever gets to the very top of the organizational structure, to the top of the hierarchy, tends to be a man. We know that people who wind up in dead-end positions will have less leadership drive. And so theorists have found that women are much more likely to be placed in positions that do not have upward mobility, where they can't move upward. And this, of course, contributes to what's known as the glass ceiling phenomenon. The glass ceiling is referring to the idea that although we can't see any kind of a structural barrier that gets in the place of women or minorities, that there seems to be a barrier, we can't see it, that's why it's called the glass ceiling, that prevents lower status individuals from moving upwards. And part of that is due to the fact that women and minorities more often are placed in positions that are dead-end positions that don't have any kind of a senior status track that's associated with that position. So now I want to point to the concept of the division of labor. And division of labor is referring to the idea that some roles and some tasks are associated with women and some are associated with men. So a lot of times when there's a male and female couple, certain types of labor is done more routinely by the female than the male. Examples, housework tends to be done more by women than it is by men. Disproportionate amount of housework done by women. Child care, more often done by women than by men. So the article on fatherhood looked at the difference in how working class men versus professional men engaged in fatherhood. So according to that article, the EMTs were not only involved in their children's public events, but also emphasized what was known as private fatherhood, which meant that they were much more involved in their daily care, so that the parenting fell much more equally between men and women in a working class household than a professional household. So that's that concept of division of labor. Now the question that this concept begs is whether the division of labor is a cause or a consequence of gender differences. That is to say that there are different characteristics that men and women have. Example, men are stronger, so perhaps they should be mowing the lawn, or perhaps they should be doing the handiwork around the house, the construction type of work, because they're stronger. But at the same time, the fact that certain duties are assigned to one gender or the other, they tend to be done disproportionately in most families by one gender or the other, that can also drive those gender differences. So there may be this interrelationship between cause and consequence of gender relationships and division of labor. Now we get to sociobiological theories. These theories actually do relate well to human sexuality, since there are some biological and physiological components we might want to consider in addition to social and psychological factors. There are evolutionary theories of gender. These ideas stem from the concept that there are biological differences between males and females, and that we've evolved to fulfill specific roles. Sociobiology stems also from the idea that there are genetic differences between us, and it's that generic heritage that caused those differences. These theories are basically Darwinian in nature. Now I want you to know the difference between Darwin and Spencer. A lot of people think that Darwin coined the phrase survival of the fittest. It was not Darwin that stated that. Darwin actually developed the theory of the evolution of species. And his idea was that a species would evolve and adapt to whatever environmental pressures existed. Spencer, on the other hand, coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And this idea is based on the idea that the fittest organism would survive, thrive, and produce more offspring. So Spencer's concept of survival of the fittest was adapted by another sociobiologist, a very prominent sociobiologist named E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson believed that most behavior is biological in origin. Wilson would advance the idea that about 80% of our behavior is caused by biological imprinting or DNA or some sort of physiological or hormonal processes. So this then creates the big debate, and that is behavior genetic or learned? Most sociologists lean towards learned, the idea that culture creates certain types of ideas and that our behaviors are based on those ideas. At the same time, there are physiological processes in our own bodies that do create certain drives, many of which are simply evolutionary in origin. So particularly in the area of human sexuality, we might want to look at the interplay between biology and culture. So I won't go as far to say that 80% of our behavior is due to biological processes, but I do want the students to challenge them to think that neither sociology nor biology by itself can account for all human behavior. So being able to recognize the limits of each analysis, we might want to consider sociobiology as a relevant theory for explaining at least some of human sexual behavior. So something that a sociobiologist might want to look at and consider is the phenomenon of rape as a biological behavior. Is there something about the biological process that makes it more likely that men will rape women versus women will rape men? At the same time, we might want to consider culture as a limiting factor in some sort of our biological drives. So that would consider the last point on the slide, and that's the idea that to what degree does being part of a social order depend upon the learned behaviors rather than the biological drives.